When a poor rancher risked his life to save two giant Apache sisters, he never imagined what their powerful chief would decide the very next day. Arizona Territory, July 1876. The desert sun didn't just shine, it burned. It was a hammer of heat that beat down on the cracked earth, turning the land into a furnace. And right in the middle of that endless, shimmering dust lived a man named Ethan Cole. If you could call it living. Ethan was a ghost haunting the bones of a dead ranch. He had a cabin that was more holes than wood, a horse so thin you could count its ribs from 50 yards, and a hunger that was a constant, dull ache in his belly. Every morning he woke up to fight. He fought the sun, he fought the dust, and most of all, he fought the crushing loneliness that threatened to swallow him whole. He was a man teetering on the edge of nothing, but the desert wasn't done with him yet. Destiny, it turns out, had one more card to play. One evening, as the sky bled red and the coyotes began their lonely song, a sound drifted through the still, hot air. It was a cry. A human cry, sharp with pain and terror, echoing from the deep, jagged scar in the earth known as Rattlesnake Canyon. Ethan's heart kicked against his ribs. Every instinct, honed by years of brutal survival, told him to stay put. Cries in the desert meant trouble. Trouble meant death. But he moved anyway. He didn't know those voices belonged to two Apache sisters, women of legend, said to be taller and stronger than any man. He didn't know their lives were hanging by a single fraying thread. And he sure as hell didn't know that saving them would plunge him into a storm so fierce it would make his own private misery feel like a summer shower. A storm that would lead him to a single terrifying moment, standing before their powerful chief while his fate, and the fate of the entire territory, was decided. The cries grew louder, pulling him forward. Ethan's worn-out boots sank into the sand, and with every step, the weight of his life seemed to press him down. He was weak from hunger, yeah, but it was more than that. It was a soul-deep weariness, the kind that comes from losing too many fights. His ranch was miles behind him now, a sad collection of weathered planks that couldn't even keep the wind from howling through the walls. His horse, Old Bones, was tied to a post, too frail to ride, with nothing but a few scraps of dry grass for comfort. Ethan's world had shrunk to this, a daily war against emptiness, and as he stumbled towards the canyon, a bitter truth walked with him. If he disappeared out here, if the desert swallowed him up right now, not a single person would notice. Not for days. Maybe not ever. His neighbors? Gone. The drought had choked their crops and their hope, and they'd packed up and left long ago. The merchants in the nearest town? They saw him as a ghost already, a man with empty pockets and a pride that was worth nothing. They'd stopped looking him in the eye months ago. The nights were the worst. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered him. The only sound was the wind, a lonely whisper scraping across the dry, warped boards of his cabin. It was in that crushing silence that Ethan had learned the one rule of survival: you just keep moving. You keep working until your muscles scream and your mind goes numb, because if you stop, the emptiness wins. It was that same stubborn, mindless strength that now pushed him down the treacherous path into the canyon. His hands, calloused and cracked from a lifetime of hard labor, grabbed onto sharp rocks to keep his balance. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps. But he didn't stop. Because the cries ahead, they held a pain that was even louder than his own. For years he had believed he was born to be alone, that his story was destined to end in a whisper, a forgotten man buried in an unmarked grave. But tonight, something was different. It felt like the desert itself was watching him, testing him, pushing him toward a moment he never asked for and wasn't ready for. His life had been a masterclass in loss. His parents, taken by a fever when he was just a boy. His older brother, swallowed by the war, leaving him with a plot of land that refused to give anything but dust and heartbreak. Every crop failed. Every calf was born weak. Every dream he'd ever had turned to sand in his hands. Still, he never left. Because leaving felt like surrender. And Ethan Cole, for all his failures, had never learned how to surrender. The moon climbed into the sky, a pale, sickly disk that cast long, ghostly shadows across the canyon floor. The cries were desperate now, closer. He pushed himself faster, his worn boots slipping on the loose rock. He snagged his foot on a root and went down hard, his knees and palms scraping against the sharp gravel. He lay there for a moment, the world spinning, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. He thought about just staying down, just letting the desert take him. But then he remembered all the other times he'd fallen, all the times he'd dragged himself back to his feet with no one there to help, no one to care. He got up. His body trembled with exhaustion, but he got up. The cries were right around the next bend. Clear now, female, filled with a raw, primal fear that cut right through him. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan's heart wasn't just beating to keep him alive. It was pounding with a terrifying, undeniable sense of purpose. He had no gun. He had no strength left to fight. He had nothing. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe he had the only thing that mattered, a spirit that was too stubborn to die. And that spirit was about to walk straight into the fire. Because waiting for him in the heart of the canyon wasn't just 2 lives in danger. It was a future he couldn't possibly imagine. Ethan rounded the final jagged wall of rock, and the sight that greeted him stole the air from his lungs. It was worse than he could have imagined. A landslide. A huge section of the canyon wall had given way, sending a torrent of rock and splintered trees down into the narrow passage. And beneath it all, pinned like insects, were 2 women. But these weren't just any women. They were giants. Apache warriors, their powerful frames held captive by the crushing weight of a massive fallen cottonwood tree. Their long, dark hair was matted with blood and dust, their faces a mask of terror and fierce, defiant pride. Even trapped and fighting for breath, they radiated an aura of power that made Ethan's legs feel weak. He froze. Every story he'd ever heard about the Apache screamed at him to run. They were a proud, fierce people. To be found here, with their women, especially in such a vulnerable state. It was a death sentence. Touching them, even to help, could be seen as an unforgivable insult. They would hunt him down. There would be no trial, no mercy. But he couldn't leave them. He saw the frantic rise and fall of their chests, heard the ragged, desperate gasps for air. They were daughters of the desert, and the desert was killing them. His heart won the war with his head. He stumbled forward and dropped to his knees beside the massive trunk. The bark was rough and sharp, and he barely felt it tear into the skin of his hands as he shoved with every ounce of strength his starved body possessed. Blood began to trickle down his wrists, mixing with the sweat and dust. The tree didn't move. Not an inch. It was like trying to push a mountain. Its immense weight mocked his feeble effort. He could hear one of the sisters choking, a terrible wet sound that spurred him into a frenzy. He repositioned himself, digging his heels into the sand, and pushed again. His muscles screamed, burning as if they were on fire. His vision swam with black spots, sweat pouring into his eyes, stinging them blind. He felt something pop in his shoulder, a sharp, searing pain, but he ignored it. "Come on," he grunted, the words torn from his throat. With a final, desperate roar that was more animal than human, he heaved his entire body against the trunk. And he felt it move. Just a fraction. But it was enough. The sister closest to him scrambled free, gasping, coughing, sucking in air like a drowning woman. Her chest rose and fell in violent spasms. Ethan staggered back, dizzy, his whole body screaming in protest. But the other sister was still trapped, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He lunged forward again, shoving his aching shoulder under the trunk, using his bones and sinew as a lever. The weight was unbearable. He could feel his ribs bending, his spine groaning. His body was at its absolute limit, begging him to quit, but his spirit refused. "Now!" he yelled, his voice cracking. The tree lifted another few inches. The second sister dragged herself out, her legs scraping uselessly against the sand before she finally pulled her body clear. The moment she was free, Ethan's strength gave out completely. He collapsed to the ground, his chest heaving, his hands a bloody mess. The world tilted and spun around him. The silence that fell over the canyon was different now. The cries of pain were gone, replaced by the heavy, ragged sound of three people simply trying to breathe. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his elbows. The sisters were getting to their feet, and they were huge, taller than him by a head, their shoulders broad and powerful even in their weakened state. In the pale moonlight, they cast long, intimidating shadows that seemed to swallow him whole. They stared at him. Their dark eyes were wide, their expressions unreadable. There was no anger, but there was no gratitude either. It was something else, something he couldn't name. A deep, profound shock, a raw disbelief. Ethan tried to stand, to say something, anything, but his legs wouldn't obey. They buckled beneath him, and he fell back into the dust, the world fading to a gray blur at the edges. His last conscious thought was a cold spike of fear. He knew the Apache would come looking for them. And when they found him here, a lone white man, with their women, there would be no questions. He had just saved 2 lives, and in doing so, he had probably just signed his own death warrant. The canyon air grew cold, the silence a heavy weight. He had just stepped into a story much larger than his own, a story that would either break him completely or finally give some meaning to his life of pain. He didn't know which. That night, back in his broken-down cabin, sleep was a stranger. Every muscle in Ethan's body screamed in agony. The cuts on his hands stung with a fiery intensity. But it wasn't the pain that kept his eyes wide open, staring into the oppressive darkness. It was fear. A cold, suffocating fear that was heavier than any fallen tree. The image of the 2 giant sisters haunted him. Standing over him in the moonlight, their faces impossible to read, their silence more terrifying than any threat. They had simply turned and melted back into the shadows of the canyon, leaving him there in the dust without a single word. Had they gone to get their warriors? Were they describing him right now to their chief, telling him about the pale, weak stranger who had dared to put his hands on them? Every creak of the old cabin, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, sounded like approaching footsteps. His heart hammered against his ribs. He could picture it so clearly. Silent, painted figures emerging from the darkness, surrounding his little shack, their arrows already nocked on their bowstrings. He rolled over on his straw mattress, the movement sending a fresh wave of pain through his shoulder. He tried to reason with himself. He'd done a good thing, a decent thing. He'd saved their lives. Surely that had to count for something. But he knew the ways of the territory. The lines were drawn deep in the dust. The Apache had their laws, their traditions. A white man touching their women. It could be seen as a violation, an insult that could only be answered with blood. The thought that his mercy could be twisted into disrespect burned hotter than his wounds. And yet, a tiny fragile flicker of hope refused to be extinguished. He remembered the look in their eyes. It wasn't hatred. It was something else. Shock, yes, but maybe something more. Maybe they would tell the story of his struggle, of how he, a man with nothing, had fought and bled to free them from the earth's grip. He stared into the gloom, where the dying embers of his fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows looked like warriors, creeping closer, their forms shifting and changing. His breathing grew shallow. If morning comes, he told himself, if I see the sun rise, it's a sign that I'm not condemned. but the night dragged on, an eternity of waiting. His mind kept replaying the events in the canyon. The desperate cries, the impossible weight of the tree, the surge of adrenaline, the immense relief when the second sister crawled free. And in that memory, he felt a strange mix of pride and sheer terror. The desert outside was quiet. Too quiet. Every lull in the wind made his skin crawl. He felt like he was being watched. He could feel their eyes on him, out there in the darkness, patient, waiting. He gripped the edge of his threadbare blanket, his knuckles turning white. He tried to cling to the idea that they owed him a debt, that an act of pure kindness had to be stronger than old rules and ancient hatreds. But a cold voice in the back of his mind whispered the brutal truth of this land. No man who lived alone was ever truly safe. Hours crawled by. The moon made its slow journey across the black, star-dusted sky. Finally, a faint gray light began to bleed along the eastern horizon. Ethan sat up, his eyes hollow and burning from lack of sleep. His small cabin felt like a cage, the silence inside a living thing. The sun was rising, but the fear in his gut only twisted tighter. Daylight didn't mean safety. It just meant he'd be able to see his death coming. And deep down, in a place beyond reason, he knew it was already on its way. The decision of the Apache chief was moving toward him across the desert plains, as unstoppable as a storm. The first rays of dawn had just begun to cut through the morning chill when he heard it. A low, distant rumble. It wasn't thunder. It was the earth itself, vibrating with a steady, growing rhythm. Ethan's heart stopped. The sound grew louder, closer. A deep, percussive drumming that shook the very foundations of his flimsy cabin. The pounding of hooves, not one horse, not a dozen, many. He stumbled outside, his hand shielding his eyes against the blinding glare of the rising sun. And what he saw on the horizon turned his blood to ice. A long line of mounted Apache warriors sweeping across the plain like a dark, unstoppable tide. Their silhouettes were sharp and menacing against the orange sky, the morning light glinting off the tips of their spears and the barrels of their rifles. They moved with a terrifying silent efficiency, fanning out as they approached, surrounding his small patch of land like a tightening noose. And riding in the center, on a magnificent black stallion, was a figure who commanded the very air around him. He was tall, straight-backed, his face a mask of granite carved by time and wisdom. It was the Apache chief. His eyes, even from a distance, were locked onto Ethan, a gaze so intense it felt like a physical blow. Ethan stood frozen, rooted to the spot in front of his cabin. His palms were slick with sweat, his breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity as he watched them draw closer. His cabin, his only shelter, suddenly looked pathetic and small, a child's toy that could offer no protection from the storm that was about to break. But he wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He forced his legs to stay put, to hold him steady, even as a primal fear clawed at his insides. The chief reined in his horse a stone's throw from the cabin and dismounted in one fluid, powerful motion. His warriors halted behind him, forming a silent, menacing circle of muscle, leather, and steel. The only sounds were the snorting of the horses and the creak of saddle leather. The air was thick with unspoken threat. Every nerve in Ethan's body screamed at him to flee, but he knew it was pointless, so he did the only thing he could. He lifted his chin and met the chief's gaze, though the sheer force of that stare felt like it could crush the life out of him. In that terrible, silent moment, Ethan was certain this was the end. His act of mercy had been a fatal mistake. He braced himself for the judgment that was about to fall. The chief began to walk toward him, his boots stirring up little puffs of dust with each deliberate step. His expression was a stone wall, revealing nothing of the thoughts behind it. Ethan's heart hammered so loudly he was sure they could all hear it, a frantic drumbeat counting down his final seconds. He saw the warriors shift, their hands resting on the hilts of their knives, their faces grim and unmoving. They were ready, waiting for the command. Ethan clenched his fists at his sides, the half-healed wounds on his palms screaming in protest. He would face it like a man. He would not beg. Time seemed to warp as the chief closed the distance, stopping so close that his shadow fell over Ethan like a shroud. In that instant, Ethan's entire life flashed before his eyes. Every lonely night, every failed crop, every desperate solitary struggle. He thought of the sisters, of the unreadable expression in their eyes. Had they spoken for him, or had their silence been his condemnation? The chief's eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to look right through him, peeling back every layer of fear and desperation, searching for the truth of his soul. Ethan felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, a breath away from the long fall into darkness. The morning air grew still. The warriors watched. The desert held its breath. And Ethan Cole, a man who had expected to die alone and forgotten, waited for the words that would either end his life or change it forever. The chief stood there, a silent, intimidating statue, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself, designed to break him. But Ethan held his ground, his gaze steady. Then the chief spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, like the sound of rocks grinding together in the heart of a mountain. And the words he said were not what Ethan expected. They shattered the fear in his chest into 1,000 pieces. "You have the hands of a worker," the chief said, his eyes flicking down to Ethan's bloody torn palms. "But you have the heart of a warrior." He turned his head slightly, speaking to his men in their own tongue. The words were sharp, authoritative, and then he looked back at Ethan. "My daughters told me what you did," he said. "They told me a pale man, thin as a starved wolf, fought a mountain to save them. They said you bled for them. They said you asked for nothing in return." Ethan could only stare, speechless. His mind couldn't process it. The chief took another step forward, closing the final gap between them. He reached out, not with a weapon, but with an open hand. He placed it firmly on Ethan's good shoulder. "The Apache do not forget a debt of blood," he declared, his voice ringing with power across the silent plain. "You saved the lives of my daughters. My blood. For this, you are no longer a stranger to us. You are now a brother. Our blood is your blood. This land you stand on is protected by my people. No harm will ever come to you here, so long as I draw breath." The words hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. His knees felt weak, and for a second he thought he might collapse. He looked past the chief and saw the warriors. Their expressions had changed. The hard, menacing glares had softened into something else. Respect. Recognition. Then, 2 figures emerged from behind the line of warriors. It was the sisters. They walked toward him, their powerful strides graceful and sure. They stopped on either side of their father. Their eyes, once unreadable, were now clear. They shone not with pity, but with a deep, humbling gratitude. With honor. In that moment, Ethan felt the crushing weight of all his lonely years lift off his shoulders. The chains of solitude and failure that had bound him for so long simply broke apart and fell away. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer invisible. He looked at the chief, at his daughters, at the circle of warriors who had come to kill him but now stood as his protectors. He had stumbled into that canyon a broken man, a forgotten soul expecting to die. He had emerged part of something larger than he could have ever imagined. But the story wasn't over, not even close. Because as the chief held his gaze, a new, unsettling glint appeared in his eyes. "But a debt is a two-way path, brother," the chief said, his voice lowering. "The rock that fell on my daughters was no accident." Ethan's blood ran cold all over again. "What?" he stammered. "The tracks of a shod horse were found near the top of the ridge," the chief explained, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. The rocks were pushed. Someone tried to murder my family. Someone wanted to start a war. He paused, his eyes narrowing. And we believed it was you. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. Ethan realized his trial wasn't over. It had just begun. He had been welcomed as a brother, but he was also the prime suspect in an assassination attempt. One of the sisters stepped forward. She was holding a tattered piece of burlap cloth. "We found this snagged on a thorn bush near the tracks," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. She unfolded it, and inside was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Ethan stared at it. He recognized it instantly. It was his. He had carved it weeks ago during a lonely night, a clumsy attempt to pass the time. He'd kept it on a small shelf in his cabin. But it wasn't there this morning. He remembered seeing the shelf was empty when he'd woken up. He had assumed it had just fallen behind the bed. But it hadn't. Someone had been in his cabin. Someone had stolen the carving and planted it at the scene of the crime to frame him. The chief and his warriors were watching him. Their newfound respect now mingled with a sharp, renewed suspicion. He was a brother, yes. But he was also the man whose mark was found at the scene of an attempted murder. He had saved the chief's daughters from the rocks. Now, he had to save himself from the evidence. "It's mine," Ethan admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The warriors around them tensed, their hands moving back towards their weapons. "But I didn't put it there. Someone was in my cabin." The chief's eyes bored into him, searching for any sign of deception. "Who?" he demanded. "Who is this other ghost in the desert?" Ethan's mind raced. Who would do this? Who hated him enough to want him dead at the hands of the Apache? And then, a name and a face surfaced from the bitter past. Silas Croft. Croft had been his neighbor years ago. A mean, angry man whose ranch had failed. He'd blamed everyone for his misfortune. The government, the railroad, the weather. But most of all, he blamed the Apache for raiding his cattle, though he never had proof, and he blamed Ethan for stubbornly surviving when he had failed. Croft had sworn revenge on them all before he'd packed up and vanished into the wilderness. "Croft," Ethan said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Silas Croft. He was run off his land 5 years ago. He swore he'd get his revenge." The chief considered this. "I have heard this name," he said slowly. "A man with poison in his heart." He looked from Ethan to his daughters, then back again. His face was a battlefield of doubt and hope. He wanted to believe Ethan. The honor of his daughter's rescue demanded it, but the evidence was damning. "Words are wind," the chief said finally. "My warriors need more than a name. They need proof. An Apache warrior proves his honor through deeds, not words. You have been named our brother. Now, you must act like one." He turned and issued a sharp command. One of the warriors led a strong, muscular pinto forward. It was a war horse, not a ranch animal. The chief took the reins and held them out to Ethan. "This man, Croft," the chief said, his voice low and intense. "You say you know him. Then you will find him. You will track him down and bring him before me to face our justice. You will ride with my best warriors. You will prove your innocence by delivering the guilty." It wasn't a request. It was a command. A test. Ethan looked at the horse, then at the hard faces of the warriors he was supposed to ride with. They didn't see him as a brother. They saw him as a suspect on a leash. If he refused, his life was forfeit. If he accepted, he would be riding into the unknown, hunting a desperate and dangerous man, with his own executioners as his only companions. He thought of his broken-down cabin, his life of quiet desperation. That life was gone forever. Whether he lived or died, nothing would ever be the same. He took the reins. "I'll find him," Ethan said, his voice finding a strength he didn't know it had. The chief nodded, a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. The trial had a new phase. Ethan Cole, the poor rancher, was now a hunter. He was riding not just for his life, but for the honor that had been so unexpectedly thrust upon him. The desert that had almost killed him was now the arena for his salvation. And somewhere out in its vast, merciless expanse, a ghost from his past was waiting. The hunt was on. Ethan swung himself onto the pinto's back. The horse was powerful, its muscles coiled like springs beneath him, a world away from his own skeletal nag. He was given a canteen of water, a strip of dried meat, and a bow with a quiver of arrows. He hadn't held a bow since he was a boy, but there was no time for lessons. He was now part of a war party. He rode flanked by two of the chief's most elite warriors, Kyle and Dakota. Their faces were grim, their eyes sharp, watching his every move. They made it clear through their stony silence that he was their prisoner as much as their companion. The chief and the rest of the warriors, including the two sisters, followed at a distance. They rode toward the ridge above the canyon where the landslide had happened. Cale, the lead tracker, dismounted and began examining the ground with an intensity that amazed Ethan. He moved like a shadow, his eyes reading the story left in the dust and rock. "The tracks are a day old," Cale announced, pointing to faint impressions that Ethan could barely see. "One shod horse, a heavy man. He rode east, toward the Badlands." The Badlands. A maze of treacherous canyons and sun-baked rock where a man could disappear forever. It was the perfect hiding place for someone like Silas Croft. They set off at a relentless pace, the warriors moving with an easy grace that Ethan struggled to match. The sun climbed higher, becoming a merciless tyrant in the sky. The heat was brutal, but the Apache seemed not to notice. They were creatures of this harsh landscape, perfectly adapted to its cruelty. Ethan, despite living here his whole life, felt like an outsider, soft and clumsy in comparison. Hours bled into one another. The landscape became a blur of red rock and thorny scrub. They spoke little, the only sounds the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the hot wind. Ethan's mind, however, was a storm of activity. He was trying to think like Croft. He knew Croft was a coward at heart, but a cunning one. He wouldn't stick to the open plains. He'd head for the most difficult terrain, a place where he thought no one would follow. But Ethan also knew something about Croft the Apache didn't. Croft was terrified of being without water. It was an obsession with him. "He won't go straight into the Badlands," Ethan said suddenly, his voice raspy from the dust. Cale and Dakota turned to look at him, their expressions unchanged. "There's no water there," Ethan continued, pushing past their intimidating silence. "Not for days. Croft wouldn't risk it. There's an old, half-forgotten spring south of here. Bitter Creek Spring. It's hidden in a box canyon. He'll go there first to fill his canteens before he disappears for good." Cale stared at him for a long moment, his dark eyes weighing Ethan's words. He then looked at the tracks they were following, which led steadfastly east. "The tracks go east," Cale stated flatly. "He's being clever," Ethan insisted, his confidence growing. "He's laying a false trail, but he'll have to cut south eventually. I know him. His thirst will always win against his wits." Cale seemed unconvinced, but he glanced back toward the chief. The chief rode forward, his gaze fixed on Ethan. He had overheard. "You are sure of this?" the chief asked. "It's a risk," Ethan admitted. "But if we keep following these tracks, he'll have a full day's head start by the time we realize he's turned. If we cut south now, we might be able to get ahead of him." It was a gamble, a huge one. If he was wrong, he would not only lose Croft, but he would also prove himself a fool to the warriors who already distrusted him. His life hung on this guess. The chief sat on his horse, silent, for what felt like an eternity. He looked at the eastern horizon, then south, as if he could see the paths laid out before him. Then he looked at Ethan, and a decision was made. "We go south," the chief commanded. Cale's jaw tightened, but he obeyed without question, turning his horse. The entire war party changed direction, abandoning the clear trail for a hunch from a white man they barely knew. The weight of that decision settled on Ethan's shoulders, heavier than any rock. He had just staked his life on the desperate thirst of a madman. They rode hard for the rest of the day, pushing their horses through the punishing terrain. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows, they arrived at the entrance to a narrow box canyon. This was the place Ethan had remembered, Bitter Creek Spring. It was eerily quiet. They dismounted, moving with silent, practiced stealth. Cale and Dakota moved ahead, their bows drawn, melting into the rocks like ghosts. Ethan followed, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a rifle being cocked. Cale raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He pointed down toward the canyon floor. There, tethered to a scrubby tree near a small pool of murky water, was a horse. And sitting by a small, smokeless fire, cleaning a rifle, was a gaunt, bearded man. Silas Croft. Ethan had been right. A wave of relief washed over him, so intense it almost made him dizzy. But it was short-lived, replaced by a cold dread. Croft was cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Before the chief could give a command, Croft's head snapped up. His eyes, wild and paranoid, scanned the rim of the canyon. He'd sensed them. In one swift movement, he dropped his rifle, grabbed a pistol from his belt, and dove behind a large boulder. A gunshot echoed through the canyon, the bullet ricocheting off the rock just inches from Cale's head. The trap was sprung. The warriors fanned out along the canyon rim, arrows nocked. But Croft was in a perfect defensive position. He was completely protected by the boulder, with a clear line of sight to the only entrance. He was pinned down, but so were they. It was a stalemate. "Give it up, Croft!" Ethan yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "There's nowhere to run!" "Cole?" Croft's voice was a crazed rasp. "You're with them? The filthy savages? I should have known! I saw you! I saw you save those two witches! I set that trap for them, and you ruined it! I was going to be a hero when the war started." He had just confessed, in front of the chief and all his warriors. Ethan felt a surge of triumph, but Croft wasn't done. "It doesn't matter!" Croft screamed. "I'll take you all with me!" He began firing his pistol wildly, the shots echoing like thunder in the confined space. The warriors took cover, unable to get a clear shot without exposing themselves. The standoff was locked tight. The chief turned to Ethan, his expression grim. "He will not be taken alive. He will fight until his last bullet. My men will die trying to get to him." Then the chief looked at Ethan with an unnerving intensity. "But you, he knows. He spoke to you. Perhaps he will listen to you." Ethan understood immediately what the chief was suggesting. He wanted Ethan to go down there, to walk into the line of fire and talk Croft down. It was a suicide mission. "He's insane," Ethan said. "He'll shoot me on sight." "Perhaps," the chief agreed, his voice devoid of emotion. "But a brother of the Apache does not hide behind rocks while others fight his battles. You brought us to him. Now you will finish it." This was the final test, the ultimate proof of his loyalty and courage, to walk willingly into the jaws of death, armed with nothing but words. He looked at the hard faces of the warriors around him. He looked at the two sisters, who were watching him, their faces tense. He had saved them from the rock. Now, he had to save their people from the man who had pushed it. His old life of quiet desperation seemed a million miles away. In its place was this single, terrifying moment of choice. Be a coward, or be a brother. He took a deep breath, the hot, dry air burning his lungs. "I'll go," he said. Ethan handed the bow and arrows back to Dakota. He stood up slowly, making sure his hands were empty and visible. "Croft!" It's me, Ethan! I'm coming down! Don't shoot! He yelled, his voice strained. Stay back, Cole! I'll kill you! Came the panicked reply from behind the rock. Ignoring the threat, Ethan began the treacherous climb down the steep canyon wall. Loose rocks skittered away from his boots, clattering down into the silence. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. The warriors above, and Croft's frantic, paranoid eyes below. He felt like a fly walking into a spider's web. He reached the canyon floor and stood in the open, about 30 feet from Croft's boulder. He could hear Croft's ragged breathing. What do you want, Cole? Croft snarled. It's over, Silas, Ethan said, keeping his voice calm and steady. They have you surrounded. There's no way out. Give yourself up. They'll give you a fair trial. A crazed laugh echoed from behind the rock. A fair trial? From them? They'll skin me alive. And you're a traitor. You chose them over your own kind. This isn't about sides, Silas, Ethan said, taking a slow step forward. This is about what you did. You tried to murder those women. You tried to start a war. For what? For a piece of land that was never truly yours? It was mine! Croft screamed, his voice cracking. And you all took it from me. You, with your stubbornness, and them, with their thieving ways. Another gunshot exploded, kicking up dust just to the left of Ethan's feet. He flinched but held his ground. That's your last shot, Silas, Ethan said, bluffing, praying he was right about the number of bullets in a pistol of that era. Your pistol is empty. The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Ethan took another step. It's just you and me now, Silas. The way it used to be. Just two neighbors trying to survive. Let's end this before anyone else gets hurt. Slowly, shakily, Silas Croft stood up from behind the boulder. His eyes were wild, his face gaunt, his clothes in tatters. He looked like a cornered animal. He held the empty pistol in his hand, his knuckles white. You should have left me alone, Ethan, he whispered. Then, with a guttural scream, he dropped the useless pistol and lunged, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. He was closing the distance in a heartbeat. Ethan had no time to think, no time to run. The warriors above were too far away to help. This was it, a fight to the death on the canyon floor. But as Croft charged, a blur of motion came from the side. It was one of the sisters. She had descended the canyon wall from a different angle, silent as a mountain cat. She moved with impossible speed, intercepting Croft's charge. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't need one. She met him head-on, her powerful frame absorbing the force of his attack. She grabbed his knife hand, and with a sickening crunch of bone, twisted his wrist until he shrieked and dropped the blade. Then, she simply lifted the sputtering, struggling man off the ground and slammed him down so hard the air rushed out of his lungs in a pained whoosh. It was over in seconds. The other warriors descended into the canyon, securing the stunned and whimpering Croft. The sister who had saved him walked over to Ethan. It was the one who had looked at him with such suspicion in the canyon. She stood before him, her chest still heaving slightly from the exertion. A brother does not stand alone, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Then the chief stood before him. The grim mask was gone, replaced by a look of profound, undeniable respect. He placed his hand on Ethan's shoulder once more. You have faced the fire, the chief said, his voice filled with emotion. You did not run. You have proven your heart. Today, you are not just a brother by name. You are a brother in spirit. My family is your family. My home is your home. They returned to Ethan's ranch not as a war party with a prisoner, but as a family. That evening, under a canopy of 1,000,000 desert stars, the Apache held a ceremony. They built a great fire, and the chief performed the ancient rite, mingling his blood with Ethan's in a sacred bond. He was no longer Ethan Cole, the lonely rancher. He was Ethan who fights mountains. He was a son to a chief, a brother to warriors, and a protector. The sisters presented him with gifts: a new, beautifully crafted saddle for his horse, a warm buffalo robe for the cold desert nights, and a necklace made of eagle feathers and turquoise, a symbol of honor and courage. His broken-down cabin was repaired by the warriors, its walls made strong and true. The land that had given him nothing but dust was now rich with the promise of shared work and shared harvests. The silence that had once crushed him was now filled with the sounds of life, of laughter, of belonging. He had walked into that canyon with nothing to lose, a man on the verge of being erased by the desert. He had found a destiny he never could have imagined, a family forged in fire and blood. One simple act of mercy, one decision not to walk away, had changed everything. He had stood against the fear, and in the heart of the wild, untamed West, he had finally found his home. If you enjoyed this story of courage and unexpected brotherhood, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales from the edge of the map.